Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on our webinar on how to ensure accessible websites and social media. We really want to thank RespectAbility for hosting this webinar. And we have some really great speakers for you today that we are going to dive right into it. So first, we want to thank all of our partners that have partnered with us on this accessibility series. We've had a great series of webinars and more to come on ensuring accessibility for the 1 in 4 people with disabilities. And we really want to thank all of these partners who collaborated with us in making this happen. So I am Tatiana Lee. I will be your moderator for today. And I want to start out with just presenting a little bit of stats, including people with disabilities and diversity. And organizations are at their best when they include all backgrounds, and that includes people with disabilities. People with disabilities, we come from all different communities. I myself am a person with a disability and also a woman and also a person of color. There's people from so many different backgrounds and religious organizations and so many different social classes that have disabilities, and we want to be included in every aspect of work, community, and everything else. And these are people with disabilities, and these are amazing people who have done amazing things in our society who also live with a disability. And their disability has not hindered them from achieving greatness. And so many more people with disabilities can achieve greatness and really step into their own when we have access. So just some stats to share with you. 61 million people live with a disability. And like I said, we want opportunities to work, be involved in community, and so much more in every aspect of our lives. And 1 in 4 adults live with a disability. So 1 in 4 working age adults live with a disability. And disability comes in so many different ways. And I think a lot of times people think disability is someone in a wheelchair. That could be someone in a wheelchair, but there's so many other ways. There's temporary, there's permanent. So temporary would be if you've broken a leg or needed surgery or something like that. Or it can be permanent where you have a spinal cord injury and you permanently have a disability. It can be visible, which I'm a wheelchair user. You can see that I have a disability, or it can be non-visible, someone with ADHD or dyslexia or something like that, or depression. Those are things that are non-visible, and it can be acquired from an accident, illness, or age, or it can be acquired, or you can be born with it. Like myself, I was born with my disability. So these are different ways that are described. These are the ways that describes people who live with disabilities. Now, I want to turn this over to our amazing speaker, Sharon Rosenblatt, who's Director of Communications at Accessibility Partners, and Dan Mouyard, who's the front-end technical architect for Form 1. They are very well versed in social media, in accessibility, web accessibility, and so much more. So I'm looking forward to really hearing what they have to share. So Sharon and Dan, please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tatiana, for the introduction. My name is Sharon Rosenblatt. I'm the Director of Communications at Accessibility Partners. I have been at the company for just about 10 years. I also identify as having a disability, and it's really influenced the way I see people and how they interact, using the web and information technology as we help companies make their technology more accessible for people with disabilities.
Hello, I'm Dan Mouyard. I also identify with a disability. I am hearing impaired, and I also visually, legally blind. So I usually have to get around with a cane if it's dark or very crowded. And I've done a lot of work mostly on the technical side as far as implementing websites and stuff to be accessible.
Great, thank you. So I'll jump in, and Dan and I are going to, kind of go back and forth a little bit, with our different perspectives on accessibility, and some tips that hopefully the attendees can take back, whether as developers or to their web team to make their sites more inclusive to people with disabilities. So accessibility is kind of one of these big words that you hear a lot, and not everybody necessarily, might know what it means, especially in the terms of web technology. It's really the design of products, devices, and services, environments for people with disabilities. You can kind of think of it as not necessarily the same type of use, but ensuring equal access. So whether or not somebody is using something the same way as another, if they are benefiting from the product and getting the information that they require, it may not be the same usage, but as long as everybody is using a product or a website for its intended usage and the right experience, then something is accessible. Okay, so anything that can be designed with accessibility. I have on the screen a picture of a road sign kind of on a desert highway, and it's a little squiggly. It's not necessarily a straight path to accessibility. So that kind of looks at the equal access, but how you get there is not necessarily the most linear. You want to focus on the members of your target audience, and again, that equal access. So it's not necessarily designing something in multiple versions for each targeted disability, but really having that equal access and usability so that every member of your target audience can benefit from that one version. So we'll get into some of those accessibility best practices that can benefit everyone else, and actually, start reaching more users than you would have thought otherwise. So some interesting facts that we've seen in the field of web accessibility, and just about 3/4 of people with disabilities will leave a website immediately if it's not accessible, often, in less than a minute, if the website isn't functioning the way it's supposed to, if they can't access it with what we call assistive technology, and I'll get to that in a second, and becomes a very frustrating experience, they will leave and more likely seek out another accessible experience, which is something that we often tell our clients who are trying to make their sites more accessible. But that being said, people with disabilities can use the internet. They do use the internet. Whether or not it's how people expect them to use the internet is a whole other issue. Some of the factors that I'll get into about web accessibility are the ability to perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with web content, and that encompasses all disabilities that would affect web access. So those are 4 overarching principles to think about when designing or fixing components of a website. So assistive technology is any sort of tech product, hardware, software, any sort of peripheral that can be used by people with disabilities to perform functions that might otherwise be difficult or impossible to execute otherwise. And I will share a couple of examples in a second, but for instance, somebody who may be unable to walk, a wheelchair can be thought of as a type of assistive technology. Hearing aids for someone who is deaf, that's another form of assistive technology.
Yeah, one really cool quote I know of for when I'm talking about technology and accessibility is a woman by the name of Judith Schumann. She worked at the U.S. Department of Education in the 90s, and she had this really great quote called, "For people without disabilities, technology makes things convenient. For people with disabilities, it makes things possible." So it really expands the ability to integrate and get this stuff done and sort of be more of a functioning part of society. That really helps.
No, that's great. I like that, perspective. One of the pictures I have on my screen here is kind of like a larger example of some more popular assistive technology that you may never think of. A hand bike can be the best form of assistive technology when competing in a marathon. Can help you win it. Here's a picture of Daniel Romanchuk winning the Boston Marathon in 2019. And this is, another type of assistive technology that you may see and not necessarily think about in that capacity. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. But going back to web accessibility, for folks who are not able to use a standard keyboard or mouse, when interacting with their computer. Other types of input devices can be used. These include on-screen keyboards, Braille keyboards. Some folks still use joysticks if they have mobility disabilities. There are multiple ways to input information. If you have an iPhone, there's speech recognition software. A Siri, which you can dictate commands to, but a lot of computers as well have speech recognition software that allows them to execute functions on there. Video phones are another type of assistive technology. This is very helpful with the increasing demand for face-to-face communication. And this can also include sign language interpretation and translation, especially if distance is any sort of barrier. I have on the top of the list here screen readers and magnifiers. These are some of the more prevalent ones that we see when looking at web accessibility. A screen reader is a software that does a text-to-speech reading. So for somebody who's blind or low vision, it will read all of the content back in the order that it's on the website. I'll get into that in a little bit so that the content is read back, and visual items like images often have some back-end coding so that they can be described to somebody who may be blind. Magnifiers for somebody who's low vision can enhance text. Also large print, anything if you, with your phone, with smartphones these days, you can, enhance images and text and make things larger. There's also tactile keyboards. Other types of assistive technology include refreshable Braille displays, which I have on the screen on that previous slide, where text on a website is translated whether wirelessly, through Bluetooth or USB, and then it's read and translated back into Braille for somebody that can also be translated onto a cell phone. So on the next slide, something that we like to always think about, and I saw this statistic, I believe from some sort of paralyzed veterans group that's from the VFW. Almost 20 million people have difficulty lifting or grasping. This includes grasping a glass or pencil, any sort of fine movement or dexterity. So this can kind of be thought about, with the proliferation of mobile technology, with so much being in our thumbs and fingertips. This can also make some sort of web navigation difficult without those sort of assistive technology devices. So going a little bit into the guidelines, and I'm going to kind of go through these a little quicker. They're a little bit too much legalese, but again, accessibility means equal access and encompasses all disabilities. If you want to start focusing on accessibility with your website, if you have an accessible website, it means that people with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with their website just as well as a similarly situated person without a disability can. So some of the features, some of the questions you may want to ask about the features of your website, before you start diving into what exactly is accessibility and some of the standards, just going back to the previous slide for a second. Is your content available to users with disabilities? We'll touch into things like alt text. I mentioned it briefly, which is a textual description for a visual element. Any form fields, if you're asking users to input information, if those are well labeled, if there's any links, can keyboard-only users navigate them? Looking at keyboard accessibility as well, some of your users might not be able to operate with the mouse. How your site interacts with the assistive technology. Again, I'd mentioned screen readers, magnifiers, speech recognition, making sure that all sorts of input are available to users with disabilities. What happens if there's multimedia, if you have any videos, if you have a podcast, anything that can be downloaded, any sort of attachments as well, like PDFs. And really, that last point is reaching out to the widest base of users, both with and without disabilities, and how you position yourself to looking at accessibility. So a little bit of this is the legalese I kind of want to go through rather quickly, especially in the nonprofit space. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which is going to turn 30 later this year, has, well, it's not really even so new anymore, has begun to cover websites under the compliance under adherence to be compliant to the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are 3 titles of the ADA. There's employment, there's state and local government, and Title III is public accommodations, which is something that your website might start to fall under. You know, religious institutions sometimes get a little difficult, but I'm I'm just here to talk generally. So on the next slide, looking at those public accommodations of the ADA, you want to make sure that you have equal access to goods and services to ensure effective communication to all of your constituents, whether or not they need auxiliary aids, which can be thought of as like sign language interpreters, other sort of services. A lot of people think about accommodations here under the ADA and have been for a number of years as physical accommodations like a wheelchair ramp or braille on buttons to get inside a building. But now with so much information being shared online, you know, even more so than in public, that can be something to look under too as the ADA.
Yeah, one really recent cool thing is that the past year, like I think it was last January, there was a big court case that was finally settled with Domino's Pizza that their website had to be accessible. And they kind of argued that it was part of, you know, the accessibility, the ADA, so that it does part of, you know, it's not just brick and mortar stores, it's also your public facing website that need to abide by that as well. And just this past October, the Supreme Court declined to pick it up. So it became sort of essentially the law of the land.
Yeah, that was really exciting, you know, for folks who are in accessibility, because it's been a little legally murky, and I definitely don't want to get into that here, you know, with this sort of handshake with the Department of Justice on how they're going to start defining accessibility and looking at those standards. I have on this slide here, in the second bullet, Section 508 and WCAG, which I will get to in a second, which are kind of going, in some spaces, they're the best practices and accepted, but right now, you know, it's for those in the public sector, like under the ADA with their businesses, it can be tricky to see what exactly it means to make it accessible. And that last bullet, I don't want to get into too much either, but there have been some demand letters where a tremendous amount of organizations, especially those in like the retail space, food, really almost all sorts of industries have been getting letters saying your website is not compliant, we're suing you under the ADA. And whether or not that's the best tactic is, you know, up for debate, but it's really been increasing a ton of energy on accessibility and bringing to the forefront a lot. So we can go to the next couple slides. I might be on a bit of a lag here, so I apologize. So here we go, the web accessibility standards. We touched a little bit on the ADA. I'm going to focus mostly in this presentation on what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. These have been around for a number of years. They're global. There is no web accessibility police that's part of the the creators of WCAG. The creators are part of the World Wide Web Consortium as part of the Web Accessibility Initiative. We say that they are not necessarily a legal requirement. The World Wide Web Consortium is not monitoring websites, but under the ADA and sort of Department of Justice kind of precedents in some of the courts, they're beginning to use this as a global standard for these lawsuits. I know this PowerPoint presentation will be distributed later. You can view a bunch of these guidelines in much more detail and coherency than I'm describing them, but these are kind of the best practices globally that are influencing web accessibility. So WCAG, and they're up to, I believe, 2.2, but 2.2.0 is kind of the global best practice for the moment that we're seeing in the United States. There are 12 guidelines. They go under those 4 principles I discussed: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust that I brought up earlier. There's testable success criteria if you're at all in compliance. There's 3 levels to adhere to. There's single A, which is one of the least stringent levels of compliance. There's double A, which is currently the best practice, and then there's triple A. And then there are various standards that you can find in each. So if you're compliant to AA, you're compliant to single A, and if you're compliant to AAA, you're compliant to AA. So going in, looking at those WCAG guidelines for receivable, again, providing any text alternatives for non-text content like images, alternatives for video content, that would be adding captions, transcripts, really creating content that could be presented in different ways without losing information or structure. So if you choose to have an image and there's no other way to describe it, you know, you may want to provide some sort of background text around it and making it easier for users to see and hear content. So how are they perceiving that information if they may not be able to see it or hear it as well as another user may be able to?
Yeah, the key thing about this perceivability is you want to focus on presenting information in multiple channels. So like visually, you know, orally, through tactile feedback, so that even if somebody can't see something, they can hear it and they can feel it. So that's part of the goal of perceivability, is give as many different channels so that as wide a range of people can still access it.
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good point. So I'm looking a little bit about the operability. That's the actions people take when they're browsing on a website. It's, you know, thinking if somebody may have a disability that gives them motor or dexterity difficulties, excuse me, they can use their keyboard to navigate, they can use their voice to navigate, but it's making sure that all functionality is available from other sorts of inputs. So, you know, there's always this trope in accessibility, unplug your mouse and see how well you can interact with the website, and then making sure that that different form of input, as Dan had said, is there so that people can use it in as many robust ways as possible. Providing users enough time to read and use content, not designing any content right now, especially in a lot of shopping sites. There's flashing content, there's carousel images that just don't stop, giving users a little bit more control of their experience, and providing logical ways to help them navigate, find content, and determine where they are on a website. Especially if you're a keyboard-only user, it's a bit more difficult to navigate up and down if all of a sudden, you know, your keyboard usability just stops and then you have to begin the experience all over again. And again, understandable. This is making sure your website, you know, has an expected experience, making web content readable and understandable. Some folks interpret this also certain reading levels for content, which is another web accessibility standard, but really just making sure things operate in predictable ways. If you have buttons, making sure that if a button is used one way on a website, if you click on it on another page, the same function happens. If you're filling out a form, helping users avoid and correct mistakes, especially some password forms where they ask for an endless amount of criteria to create a password, letting the user know what's wrong with what they've inputted, and providing helpful feedback.
And it's also very important to make sure that you organize your website so that it is easy to understand, so that things are in sections that kind of make logical sense. And another thing to keep in mind is, like, for people who you can't see a website, they get it through other ways, you know, from listening to it or, you know, tactile feedback, is that they can't just see the whole website at once. They have to sort of, it's kind of a blank canvas, and have to gradually figure out where things are. So the more easy you make it, so you can explore that page, you know, makes it very helpful for those.
Yeah, no, that's great, Dan. And the last one in WCAG is keeping your website robust. And this is making sure that your website interacts well with assistive technology. You know, your site can operate on the most current version of the browser. There's nothing in the back that's outdated or creates those unexpected versions. It's kind of just like a nice handshake to make sure everybody gets along with your users. So I kind of touched on this a little bit with the ADA covering websites. That public access does not relate just to locations. Dan had brought up Domino's. You know, you can order pizza online or you can order it in the store, but with more people doing it online or on an app, the ADA is looking at that as well as a public accommodation and definitely covering it. And the WCAG 2.0 is currently the best practice. All right, so I'm going to jump into this, and I'm hoping Dan goes a bit in tandem with me too. These are some accessibility design tips for some of the web developers on the call and designers. We're hoping to speak to you on a number of levels. I'm a bit more on the introductory, and Dan will definitely have some more actionable tips. We talked a bit about alternative text. This is a textual alternative to image content, whether it's a picture like the one of the car I have on my screen. It could be a scanned image. It could be a chart or a graph. Alternative text on the back end describes the purpose of a graphic, not necessarily its appearance. So you want to keep in mind, you know, whatever you've inserted onto your site and you want to have conveyed back to your user, any of that important content, whether or not it's there for visual enhancement or it could be a link to other areas, but really the purpose of why it's there, not necessarily what it looks like. And that's something something that someone who is cited may take for granted.
Yeah, and this is one of the cases where there can be a lot of discussion on whether something needs to have sort of that text alternative, especially like when you talk about parts of your site where you're sort of like just using images as sort of like give a general sense. You know, it's not actually content, so that can be kind of a little gray line, but basically if the image is on the page that conveys information, that information should also be conveyed via text.
Yeah, no, that's great. Going along there as well, for users who may be blind or have low vision, or they may be colorblind, color alone should never be the sole way to convey information. Some users with disabilities, like those who are colorblind, cannot distinguish colors between colors, and this can also lose meaning if you're using a high contrast browser. So I have a very outdated image, but I love this one so very much. It's a screenshot of a questionnaire that says, click on the green button to win a car, or the red button to erase your hard drive, and they are both buttons. One is green, one is red, but they're both labeled to go. So if somebody who is blind and is tabbing through the buttons, their screen reader would just read both as go. Screen readers don't announce colors. So if there's other ways to share information besides color, it's definitely advisable. Do not use color alone as an identifier. We have on this slide a nice little color wheel. Other sorts of things that you can use for emphasis, especially on webinars like this, are vocal inflections, other emphases from the body text. Even if you underline things, if you italicize things, again, those aren't read by screen readers, but they're another way to be a bit more accessible for other users. And then there's color contrast, which I'll get into in a second. Black and white is ideal. It's got the highest ratio of colors. You're looking at your background and your foreground colors, but accessibility is not a commandment to be boring. There's certainly, you know, many ways to use colors on your website. There's some freeware that you can download. If anybody reaches out, I can send some links to test for color contrast on your site, you know, seeing how well some of the colors go. The color wheel I have, any color that's necessarily opposite, right, from the other one has the highest contrast in some degrees, or not, I'm not a color scientist, but with different ways on the color spectrum. So these are some examples of good color contrast. And again, you know, I'm not trying to make your website look like a Pier 1 showroom, but it's, you know, other ways to look at it, you know, either having a lighter background and a darker foreground or vice versa. And then timeouts, a lot of folks encounter these if they're trying to buy concert tickets, for instance, if they're filling out a form, if there's some sort of exam prompt in an academic setting. These are used to track a user's inactivity or how long it takes them to complete something. For somebody who may be blind or have a cognitive disability, there may not be enough time to either finish the prompt, or a user would have no way of knowing how much time is left. So these are things to look into with web accessibility, is how well somebody with assistive technology can see how much time is left, you know, how this is announced, and if his session expires, where they're returned to. Descriptive links, this is very huge. It ties back into keyboard accessibility, certainly. Any links that you have should be accessible via the keyboard, but they should also be descriptive. If the user is tabbing through a website and all of your links are just saying, click here for more content. Being read out of context can be a bit confusing. So we always emphasize having a good descriptive link with perhaps part of the title of where the page is going, a brief summary, so that if the links are read out of order and they all say click here, it's a bit more of an accessible experience. And having proper link structure, if it's keyboard accessible, it will work with all major types of assistive technology. This is a little bit more in depth, but again, labeling the form fields. I have actually a very bad example of color contrast with a screenshot of a form on my slide here, but when coding for a form, there's different sorts of labels that you can have in the background so that the visual form field here would be first name, last name, and company. When a user with assistive technology may be filling it out, whether with their mouse or with their keyboard, when they tab through it or go into the next form field, that title of the field is read back to them with their assistive technology so they know what sort of information to input there. This is not just for text fields, you can have this for combo boxes with that country, select country drop down, and other sorts of checkboxes. These would all require the label element. You can't just assume that just because the text is to the left of it, that it will necessarily make the association with a user of assistive technology. And then kind of very, very basic, we talked a little bit about at the beginning of the presentation for any multimedia, video or audio, having captions, yes, but making sure that they are synchronized with what's happening on the screen, that there's no sort of lag, except for live content can be a little bit more forgiving. And that any of those equivalent alternatives, whether it's a transcript, subtitles, captions, are synchronized with the content so that they can be kind of, encountered in tandem. And one of the big things I want to leave users with, start looking for web accessibility on your own, is that keyboard usage, making sure any points of interaction, any links, buttons, menus, form controls, are operable from the keyboard. Test with your tab and enter keys, your arrow keys as well for drop downs or lists. And this is one of the biggest ways you can start seeing, the experience that a user with assistive technology may have on your website, because this will also look at the order that things are read. So if your focus is jumping from one place to another, or some areas aren't touched at all and only accessible by the mouse, those can be huge areas of inaccessibility for some users. And then going back to the keyboard, this is an area called skip navigation for websites that have a lot of content on a menu bar. You see this a lot in retail sites where if you scroll down and things are organized by different categories, having a link at the top that's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be huge, but it can kind of jump a user down to the main content to an anchor spot lower to bypass that content so that it's not repetitive or redundant for somebody who's trying to go to the next page and then still has to hear your menu read out. And again, I know these are kind of a lot all at once. I'm happy to answer questions. There's so many things that can be on websites, especially for nonprofits. Tables, we see this a lot if you're sharing budget information, as tables are a largely visual way to share information, really not changing the structure that much, using row and column headers appropriately. I have an example of some code on my screen. Having the TH, which stands for table header, identified, and for all of the data cells below, the TD in the next table row, it can show the association with the column headers above. And I'm not going to get too far into, Dan may want to, about what complex tables may need to start associating with the right content, because the last thing you want is just a bunch of nonsensical numbers read out via assistive technology.
Yeah, for tables, it's basically just how it's coded in the back end, so that all the headers are associated with the, whatever the data cell is within it.
So that was probably the quickest introduction to web accessibility in WCAG that we've done. Again, I'm here for questions. Dan is a tremendous resource too for those who want much more than the introductory level I've done there, and I'm excited to see what Tatiana has to say about social media accessibility.
Thank you so much, Dan and Sharon. Thank you both. I learned so much from all of this information, and I hope you guys got a lot of great information. And in a minute, we will have chance to answer questions. So if you guys want to put in your questions now, we will definitely have time to answer them. And I am going to run really quick over social media accessibility. So we talked about ADA compliance and things like that. And so open captions is best for social media, and open captions make sure that people can read your digital content. We're in an age where there's so much digital content that is out there, and a huge percentage of people, if you don't put captions on your video, cannot consume your content. And just to let you know, 80% of viewers who leave their YouTube or whatever on audio play are usually watching it with the sound down. And so that are even people who aren't deaf or hard of hearing. So you are more likely to have people consume your content if you put captions on your video, which is very, very important because it will open up more people to consuming your content. And so it just goes to show you that being accessible makes it better for everyone, not just people with disabilities. And 85% of Facebook video is watched without sound. And those are some more stats. So many people will just watch their videos with the sound down. And so it's really, really great to make sure you have captions on your videos. YouTube actually does automated captions that you just click a button. Sometimes it's not as accurate, but you can easily add it on there, and then you can add it to your other videos and so on and so forth. And it's very, very easy and simple, and it's free or low cost. And then there's other ways you can do it to also apply it to Twitter, Snapchat, and things like that. And these are just some stats to let you know of how much people consume social media that is on the internet, and they use it as ways to get their message out to the world. And just like websites, images on social media need to be described as well. So if you guys tune back with us on Thursday, we will actually be going over how to add the alt text to your Twitter, your Facebook, your Instagram, and things like that, because that has accessible things already embedded in it, and you just need to do a few little tweaks and things to add in so that your social media content is accessible to everyone. And then another tip, just to let people know, I don't know if you know, but when you add alt text into your website, it actually makes your website more visual or seen higher in on Google. So more people are likely to see your content when you add that alt text to your website. And so that's something else to think about. And that applies with social media as well on a lot of things. So like I said, join us Thursday. We will have in-depth tutorial. I and my colleague, Eric, we will be going over social media accessibility from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Vimeo. And if you have any requests, please let us know. We will work on having that available to you. And now here are some additional resources. Clip-O-Matic is a really, really great website. Well, it's not a website, it's an app that you can download, and it automatically adds text as you speak to upload to your Instagram, your YouTube, Facebook, anywhere you want to put your digital content out. And like I said, YouTube does a free generator. So that is fairly easy. Sometimes it may mishear a word here and there, but we're going to cover more of that in depth. And then there's another option, which is Rev Com, which if you don't have time to add the text yourself, they have a 24-hour turnaround time, and they charge you $1 for ever a minute your video is. So if you have a 5-minute video, they will do the complete open or closed caption for you for $1 a minute, which is really, really great resource. So those are some different things to think about. And I want to thank Sharon and Dan so much for being here and bringing your knowledge. And so now we are going to take this time to do Q&A. So please, if you have any questions for either Dan, myself, Sharon, Eric is here. He can answer any great questions. So we are all here. So please, we want to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, and all of our speakers. My organization will soon be going through the process of redesigning our website. Users with disabilities are not our primary audience, but we'd like to make it more accessible in general. What's the best place to start when redesigning a website? I think the basic things are alt text on images, captions on videos, and make sure basically everything was discussed in this webinar pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, as far as the best place to start for making an accessible site, if you're just getting started on a project, is to start thinking about it even before you get started. So you thinking about it right now is very important, because if you wait until like the website is almost finished and you're just about to launch it in a week or so, and you're like, oh, we need to make it accessible, it will vastly increase the amount of time that's needed to make the website accessible. And so you have it from the very beginning, you have accessibility in mind when you're doing the user interface architecture of how the pages are laid out. When you're talking about design and what color to use and how they go together, you want to be thinking about accessibility through each of those different steps.
Yeah, and I think coming off what Dan said, my goodness, thinking about it from the onset will save you a tremendous amount of time and resources down the road. Reach out to people with disabilities that you know. If you have a committee or any sort of group, factor in some input from users with disabilities about what they see as good and bad examples of design. You can have a sort of free focus group, but getting those voices in from the planning stage can be great.
Yeah, and if you do any sort of like usability testing on your website, again, make sure at least some of those users that you're inviting to sort of do that testing also have various kinds of disabilities, so you can have a wide range of feedback of what's good and what needs to be improved on your site.
Yeah. And also I wanted to add, I think people shouldn't assume that people with disabilities aren't your audience. People with disabilities are everyone's audience, because we fit into every community. There are people with disabilities. We are a huge community, actually the largest. 1 in 4 people live with a disability. So I think that organizations and people shouldn't assume that people with disabilities aren't your audience, because we're part of every audience.
Yeah, another thing to consider is why disability should be important is because the things that we do to make things, available and to be used for people with disabilities makes it even easier for people who don't have disabilities to sort of comprehend and get that same content. Just like how, like on a street where they have like going down to the street where they have like the what do they call it, like the rubber bumps on the floor, so that people who are using wheelchairs, they can feel it whenever they get close to the edge of the street. That same technology also helps, someone pushing a baby stroller or a shopping cart be able to just by feeling see where they are in reference to the street. So that's kind of thing kind of helps everybody, not just for that, what you might be thinking of just that small target audience. It actually affects everybody.
Okay, so we got a lot of questions while we're answering that one, so we'll get through as many as we can. So I'm going to start with Tara's. When we post news articles on Facebook, it's for something to do for accessibility. Tune in Thursday. We will have plenty of details on that. There's lots of things to do. I'll quickly say that image descriptions or alt text for any images that the featured image that comes with any Facebook article is the best practice that we've implemented at RespectAbility, and I think it's a good best practice for everyone to implement. So lots of questions about websites that people can use for usability testing or to do an ADA assessment. Do any of the panelists have answers for that one?
Dan, I'm happy to tackle this one, unless you want to.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
There are some certainly free accessibility checkers online. There's some toolbars that I am always cautious to recommend. There are automated ways to check your website. They can find some of those quick issues, images without alt text, but they're not going to assess the qualitative experience of your website. They're great for catching a bunch of issues all at once. But keeping in mind that your overall website is designed to interact with people and not to pass a test. So these sort of automated checkers, I believe Chrome has one. There's a web accessibility toolbar. Some of my competitors make them as well. Can help you, look for areas that are inaccessible, but they're not going to necessarily look at the quality of your website. For images that require alt text, you're going to want to make sure that whatever you provide is informative an equivalent, and a checker would just automatically pass something if it just said graphic. So yes, there are certainly places to start. There are dozens of accessibility checkers you can find by Googling and different plugins, but that is something I would still be mindful of, is having a good handshake, not relying solely on automated checkers.
Yeah, the automated checkers basically fall into two categories. There's the one that you can just let run and go, and they're going to be more or less 100% accurate. They can answer things that a computer can answer very quickly. Yes, no, that have enough color contrast. Yes, no, that they have alt text on an image. The other class of things that it can kind of catch, but you need some manual oversight to make sure what they do catch is an actual error or not. As Sharon mentioned, the automated checker may test, yes, it has alt text, but is it an appropriate alt text? Another thing to keep in mind is you want to do these automated testing tools before you give it to somebody who's an actual user, because you don't want to be spending their time saying, no, this doesn't have alt text. You don't want them wasting a lot of time finding issues that a computer tool could have done much easier and quicker.
So also a website recommended to look to purchasing assistive technology. Do you have any ideas for that? Or
That's a big question. I will say, it depends who you're purchasing for. Definitely keep in mind the individual user. I know this is kind of a large non-answer, but if you're buying for somebody without knowing their needs, I see this a lot in large offices where they say, oh, you know what, we have, an ergonomic chair and it's perfect for everyone, and it doesn't work. There are different screen readers that some people prefer. Even within my office, we have two different types of screen readers. And a lot of assistive technology, too, is built into our devices. If you're looking to just kind of get started, Windows has Narrator built in, and that's a screen reader. They have their own magnifier built in. Mac has, Apple has has a VoiceOver, especially, and we can see this on your iPhone. So there are some free solutions, but I would, look into what your budget is and the user that you're purchasing for, because all sorts of organizations have various purchasing powers.
So Kate asks about whether screen readers read hashtags correctly when they have the first letter of each word capitalized.
So for screen readers, it depends. Like different screen readers will handle that kind of text differently. Some of them, they will have different pronunciations, whether it's all capitalized or not. So sometimes if it's kind of complicated, it'll just read. They won't read it as a word. They'll actually spell out all the different letters. So it really depends on how you create the hashtag, I believe, and it depends on what screen reader you're using.
Do you guys have the answer for best ways to show links during a live PowerPoint?
I think one of the best ways to have this is probably like a bit.ly link, like one of those link truncators. It certainly depends as well, because it's, you're not going to have users clicking on a link during a live PowerPoint, but then if it's distributed later, as long as the context around it makes sense, that should be fine too. Really just thinking about the most appropriate usage for your setting. If something's a tremendously long URL, definitely truncating it, would be for the best. But if it's kind of just say whitehouse.gov, that might just be enough for somebody.
And I do know that we make it a practice that after each presentation, our PowerPoints are posted to our website, including this one. So after this one ends, you'll be able to click on any links and download all the PowerPoints and go through it as much as you want at our website. And I pasted the link in the chat earlier, and I'll do that again. So that's an option. Are there any compiled resources available that provide instructions on how to incorporate better accessibility for websites? My organization is interested in creating a more accessible website, but they aren't as tech savvy and can build code to create tables or new functions from scratch.
There's a lot of great resources out there. I think the first place to start would be the Web Accessibility Initiative, the WAI. They're the ones that handle the WCAG 2.0 guidelines, and they have a lot of online information for like what their standards mean and different ways to address them.
And another place that can be good to look at too, just to throw more acronyms at you, is called WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind. And their website is just webaim.org. They have accessibility training, they have a checker as well, but I have found they have the most actionable suggestions and tutorials when trying to just learn more about web accessibility. That's certainly where I started too a bunch of years ago. And they're also a nonprofit, so from one nonprofit to another, I think they're tremendous.
Well, one more question that I found that I think is going to be an interesting one for discussion is, what are the most effective arguments to present to developers who omit accessibility? This person says the population argument is not very convincing, which I'll leave it up to our speakers.
I mean, that's a tricky one because you're not exactly sure what's going to resonate most well to people, especially if they think they don't know somebody with a disability, so they don't understand how it relates to them. I mean, there's certainly a bunch of drivers. There's financial incentives to be accessible, whether or not you're getting more constituents or consumers because you have a more accessible web experience or because you are avoiding a lawsuit. Some people, unfortunately, respond well to fear of litigation. I mean, it certainly can be an uphill battle. A lot of people come to accessibility for a number of reasons. It's not only because they want to just be nicer to people as well, but they kind of, you know, seeing some of the larger features of what the current landscape looks like. Tatiana had discussed about the metadata behind accessibility driving up like search engine optimization too. Having alt text, especially, you know, with your company's name, can really bump up your Google ranking as a side effect. So there's kind of some free marketing there as well.
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff that, you know, making a site accessible has sort of these secondary and tertiary benefits that you might not necessarily think of when you first implement them. Excuse me. Another thing I want to point out is for particularly toward developers who are like, as you say, don't really want to focus on accessibility because it's a small population or you know, something like that, is a lot more time is usually spent on making a website work on older browsers than it is on accessibility, when like the older browser that they're supporting may only be, you know, 1% of their users, whereas the people who are disabled are much higher than that. And so they have to sort of balance that, what their priorities are for the time that they have to spend. What can they fix that helps the most people?
And I would agree with all of that, but I think my personal opinion is that the emphasis should be on that if you don't think that helping people with disabilities is enough reason, help yourself. I mean, accessible websites are just better websites. They work better. They're treated better by search engines, and yeah, accessible is better. So Dawn asks, what are some examples of great accessible websites?
Dawn, I would look to, I can always send you a link. A lot of the federal agency websites, because their web accessibility standards have been enforced a lot longer than those, you know, in the private sphere, especially the USDA. Last I checked, their website was very accessible. You can see good examples of skip navigation. Even Target's website, for the most part, is fairly accessible because they've put a tremendous amount of work into it as well. But I would definitely look into some of the federal agency websites. I'm not sure if things have changed in the past couple of years, but there are some of the best practices too. Look into, and WebAIM has a number of kind of, you can see snapshots of good and bad context, you know, looking at those tables to compare and contrast with.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's so many different websites, and there's sort of a range of accessibility of what they fall under. So it's hard to give like, so accessibility, like it's never like, you're never going to reach 100%. You know, 100%
Exactly.
is completely accessible to every person in the world, regardless of whatever, you know, they have to deal with. And that's never going to happen, but you want to work as close as you can to that magical 100% number. And so it's really hard to say this particular website is exactly what you want to strive for because it's not 100%. But as far as ones that do, you know, tend to do better, I would agree with Sharon. It is some of the early adopters of accessibility in the government space, like USDA, EPA. There is an organization called 18F that recently, they sort of like are the, I don't know how you describe them, but they're sort of like a small organization that allows the contracts sort of refer to as sort of what are the best practices to get our agency up in the web. And they have a large focus on accessibility. There's also, if you want something a little bit more specific, there is the United States Web Design System, which is put together sort of like a design style guide system that has all of these sort of pre-built and pre-designed like typography, headings, as well as form element buttons, and all that kind of different pieces you would put together to make a website. They have examples of all of those, and that's extremely accessible as well as well designed.
Cool. I think we have time for like 2 more questions, or 1 more actually. So, does the US DOJ have any settlements or decisions describing what a public entity's webpage must do to be non-discriminatory?
There's a bunch in some of the lower courts. You know, below the Supreme Court, there's some. I can always send some links as well to you too, Eric. Right now, the DOJ. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm probably not describing this as well as I should be. Put a pause on kind of finalizing that handshake with saying, yes, to be accessible, you must follow WCAG 2.0 level AA. They are saying, yes, you have to be accessible, but right now it's a little bit murky. So there are some settlements. I know Dan brought up Domino's. There was a web case, and I have to find, I have a list of these somewhere. And there's another lawyer who follows all this with grocery stores and restaurants, H&R Block, Publix, where some of these lawsuits have settled, and all of the lower courts, you know, lower than the Supreme Court, have said WCAG 2.0 AA is the best practice. But unfortunately, that has not been applied countrywide yet. But it is the trend that we're seeing these lawsuits go to, the higher they go up with prosecution.
Yeah,
it's a little frustrating. So I have to choose my words carefully.
Yeah, so basically I would just say, you know, aim for the WCAG, because that's generally where the consensus is going. And if you need a place to start with the A, the WCAG 2.0 A, because the A is sort of like, these are the things that will completely prevent somebody from doing something. And so those are the very most important things you want to fix. And then you go to the AA, which is things that are more of a hindrance that can really not necessarily completely stop. So then you aim for that AA. And then once you have all that done, then you can aim for the AAA in cases where it makes sense for your website and organization.
Well, I want to say, first of all, thank you so much to all of our presenters and speakers today. Tatiana, Dan, Sharon, we really appreciate it. Tatiana and I will be back on Thursday for a live demo webinar type thing. We're going to be doing a lot of live demonstrations on some of the stuff we talked about in more broad strokes today on Thursday. And I'm very excited for that. So I am looking forward to seeing you all back on Thursday. And for more of the legal stuff, actually next Wednesday, Matan, one of our colleagues, is moderating a webinar on the legal aspects of accessibility. So for some of the legal questions that we didn't really have answers to, maybe Matan will have some. So thank you all so much for joining us. We will hopefully see a lot of you on Thursday. Have a great rest of your day.